The dirt beneath their boots made a particular sound that day, a crunching noise that cut through the humid silence hanging over the abandoned compound. It was late October in 1944, and the Philippine island of Leyte had become another contested piece of ground in the vast Pacific theater. The garrison the Japanese had occupied and then hurriedly evacuated still bore traces of their presence, but the American soldiers, moving cautiously through the empty structures, expected to find ammunition stores or perhaps a few stragglers preparing an ambush. What they discovered instead would challenge everything they thought they understood about the war they were fighting. Inside one of the buildings, barely visible through gaps in the bamboo walls, someone was watching. A young woman pressed herself against the rough interior, her breathing shallow, her body tensed in anticipation of what she had learned over 3 years to expect from the sound of military boots. The uniforms moving past her hiding spot were different from those she had grown accustomed to seeing, but uniforms had never meant safety. They had only ever meant pain, control, and the systematic destruction of everything she had once been. The voices speaking words in a language she could not comprehend only added to her terror. Change, in her experience, had never brought anything but additional suffering. One of the soldiers paused near where she hid. Through the crack in the wall, she could see his face, younger than she might have expected, marked by the weariness that characterized men who had been fighting for too long. When he called out, his tone lacked the harsh command she had been conditioned to obey. The gentleness in his voice felt like a trap, another form of cruelty designed to break her further before the violence began. She closed her eyes and waited for the inevitable. The words came again, softer this time, and she heard other voices joining in. The door to the building opened slowly, carefully, as though those entering feared what they might find. Light flooded the space where she and others like her had been living in shadows. The soldier who spoke first kept his rifle lowered, his hands visible and empty of threat. He repeated himself, and though the language remained incomprehensible, something in the repetition suggested he was trying to communicate safety. She did not believe it. Belief had been beaten out of her long ago. What the Americans uncovered in that compound and in others like it scattered across Leyte would expose a machinery of exploitation that had been operating in the shadows of the Japanese military empire for more than a decade. The system had been deliberately constructed to remain invisible, hidden behind euphemisms and geographic isolation, protected by layers of secrecy that ensured its victims remained voiceless and its perpetrators unaccountable. The discovery represented not just a humanitarian crisis requiring immediate response, but evidence of an organized crime that had conscripted tens of thousands of women into a form of slavery specifically designed to service military objectives while maintaining plausible deniability about its existence. The origins of this system reached back to the early 1930s, when Japanese military expansion into Manchuria created logistical challenges that planners believed required innovative solutions. The establishment of what would be called comfort stations began as an attempt to address concerns about military discipline and the prevention of random violence against civilian populations in occupied territories. The reasoning presented to justify the system emphasized control, order, and the maintenance of fighting capacity among troops stationed far from home for extended periods. Behind this rational veneer lay assumptions about expendability, about which lives mattered and which could be consumed in service of imperial ambition. The recruitment methods employed to populate these stations ranged from deception to outright kidnapping. Young women, many still in their teenage years, found themselves targeted by a system that understood vulnerability and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. Some were approached with offers of employment in factories or restaurants, promises of wages and opportunity that seemed like escape routes from poverty. Others were simply taken, seized from their homes in the night by men who faced no consequences for their actions. The women came from Korea, from China, from the Philippines, and as the war expanded its reach, from Indonesia, Malaya, and the scattered islands of the Pacific. Geography mattered less than availability and the calculations of those who saw human beings as resources to be allocated. Once in the system, escape became functionally impossible. The stations themselves were positioned deliberately far from population centres, placed in locations where isolation guaranteed control. The architectural elements remained consistent across different sites. Wooden structures, usually barrack-style buildings, surrounded by barriers that could be barbed wire or bamboo, depending on available materials. Guard towers provided observation points that ensured constant surveillance. A central administrative building housed the military personnel responsible for managing the facility. Every element of the design emphasized containment and the absolute authority of those in charge over those confined within the walls. The daily existence imposed on the women followed patterns calculated to destroy autonomy and resistance. Schedules were rigid and enforced without exception. Silence was mandatory unless speech was explicitly permitted. Every movement was monitored, every interaction controlled. The psychological architecture of the system proved as effective as the physical barriers. Women were told repeatedly that no rescue would come, that their families had abandoned them as shameful, that any attempt to escape would result in immediate execution. After months and years of this conditioning, hope itself became impossible to sustain. Even when the sounds of battle approached, when it became clear that the war was turning against their captors, many of the women could not imagine that liberation might actually occur. Japanese military authorities justified the comfort station network through arguments about military necessity and the protection of civilian populations from undisciplined troops. The claim that organized brothels would prevent random assaults and maintain morale among soldiers fighting prolonged campaigns became the official rationale. Yet the reality bore little resemblance to these justifications. What was presented as a measure to protect became itself an instrument of systematic violation. What was claimed to preserve discipline became an institutionalization of exploitation. The gap between the stated purpose and the lived experience of the women trapped in the system revealed the fundamental dishonesty at its core. As the conflict expanded from the Second Sino-Japanese War into the broader Pacific War, the network of comfort stations grew in parallel with military operations. Every major garrison required its own facility. Cities like Nanjing, Shanghai, and Hankow saw these establishments multiply. By the time the Pacific War reached its peak intensity in the early 1940s, comfort stations could be found everywhere. Japanese military forces maintained a presence, from the frozen territories of Manchuria in the north to the tropical islands of the Solomon Chain in the south. The system had become inseparable from military operations themselves, a shadow infrastructure that followed conquest wherever it led. The mechanisms of control extended beyond physical containment. Women trapped in the stations endured psychological manipulation designed to break their sense of self. They were told constantly that they were worthless, that they had been abandoned, that death was preferable to their current existence, but that death itself would be denied them as long as they served a purpose. The messages were crafted to create helplessness and to eliminate any belief in the possibility of change. Years of such treatment left marks that went deeper than any physical injury. Identity itself became a casualty, eroded by the relentless messaging that reduced human beings to their utility within a system that valued them only for what could be extracted. Official documentation of the comfort station system was deliberately obscured. Records were coded using euphemisms that disguised the nature of the facilities. When documentation existed at all, it often disappeared through systematic destruction as military positions became untenable. Survivors were ordered never to speak of their experiences, threatened with consequences if they broke silence. The shame associated with sexual violence in traditional cultures became another tool of suppression, ensuring that even if women survived their captivity, social pressure would keep their stories buried. The system was designed not merely to exploit, but to erase, to ensure that its crimes would leave no trace except in the traumatized bodies and minds of those who endured it. By 1944, the strategic situation facing Japan had deteriorated dramatically. American submarines had throttled shipping lanes that connected the empire to its conquered territories. Allied bombers were reducing cities to ash. Ground forces were pushing closer to the home islands with each campaign. Yet within the comfort stations scattered across the shrinking perimeter of Japanese control, the routines continued unchanged. The women remained imprisoned, subjected to the same violence and control that had defined their existence for years. For them, the turning tide of war meant nothing unless it reached the walls that confined them. The Philippines campaign represented a critical turning point. General Douglas MacArthur had promised to return to the islands after being forced to evacuate in 1942, and in October 1944 that promise was fulfilled with amphibious landings on Leyte. The Japanese garrisons defending the island found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. As American forces advanced inland, Japanese commanders made the calculation that their positions were no longer tenable. They ordered retreats, abandoning the installations they had occupied. In their haste to escape, they left behind everything that might slow their movement, including the women they had claimed were essential to military morale. The abandonment was perhaps the final evidence of how the comfort station system had always viewed its victims as disposable. For the women remaining in the compounds after their captors fled, the sudden silence carried its own terror. Abandonment did not immediately register as liberation. Years of conditioning had taught them that soldiers always returned, that escape was impossible, that hope was a delusion. The absence of their usual guards could easily be a prelude to mass execution, a final erasure of witnesses. They had no way of knowing that the sounds of battle approaching from the east represented forces that might respond to their existence differently than their captors had. The possibility of rescue existed outside their capacity to imagine it. The American soldiers advancing through the Philippine countryside expected to encounter resistance at every turn. Their training had prepared them for ambushes, booby traps, and desperate last stands by defenders who had been taught that surrender meant dishonor. When they reached compounds that appeared to be military installations, they approached with caution, weapons ready, expecting contact. What they found instead defied every expectation. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, leading elements of the 32nd Infantry Regiment, was among the first to encounter the reality hidden behind the walls of what he had assumed was a minor enemy position. The compound near Tacloban showed signs of recent occupation, but no evidence of defensive preparations. Rice was scattered across floors where meals had been interrupted. Buildings that should have housed soldiers stood empty. The silence felt wrong, charged with a tension that combat veterans recognized as the prelude to violence. Hayes ordered his men to search methodically, clearing each structure. In the rear of one wooden building, they heard movement that suggested someone hiding. The door resisted initially, then gave way. What lay beyond stopped the soldiers in their tracks. Women occupied the space, dozens of them, pressed into corners and against walls in postures of absolute submission. Their physical condition was shocking even to men who had witnessed the aftermath of brutal combat. Malnutrition had reduced bodies to skeletal frameworks. Clothing hung in rags. Faces bore expressions that communicated terror and resignation in equal measure. When the American soldiers appeared in the doorway, the women's reaction was not relief, but increased fear. They bowed their heads, avoiding eye contact, bodies tensing in anticipation of violence. For a moment that seemed to stretch impossibly long, neither group moved. Hayes and his men were combat infantry, trained for entirely different challenges than the humanitarian crisis confronting them. They lowered their weapons instinctively, recognizing that these women posed no threat and were themselves in desperate need of help. But how to communicate safety across language barriers and the gulf of trauma became the immediate challenge. Hayes called for medics and ordered his men to give the women space, to avoid crowding them or making movements that might be interpreted as threatening. The soldiers found themselves in a situation their training had not prepared them for, requiring patience and gentleness in the midst of a combat zone. The reports that reached division headquarters carried a tone of disbelief. These were not Filipino civilians caught in the crossfire. They were not captured military personnel. The women came from Korea, from China, from territories across occupied Asia. Their presence in a Japanese military compound raised questions that demanded answers. What system had placed them there? How had they come to be trapped in this remote location? The officers receiving these reports struggled to comprehend the implications, even as they ordered immediate medical support and evacuation procedures. Private Daniel Martinez, one of the first soldiers to enter the building, later tried to describe what he witnessed in those initial moments. The women's conditioning was so complete that they could not accept the possibility of rescue. When he attempted to offer food, the woman nearest him flinched as though expecting the offering to be a pretext for harm. When he tried to help someone stand, she recoiled, convinced that kindness was impossible and that any interaction with a soldier could only end in pain. Martinez realized that simply entering the room had traumatized them further, because their experience had taught them that soldiers only brought suffering. As American forces pushed deeper into Leyte, similar discoveries multiplied. Each compound revealed variations on the same theme. Women held in secret, their health destroyed, their capacity for trust so damaged that even rescue felt like another form of threat. The pattern became undeniable. This was not a random occurrence, but evidence of a systematic structure that had operated across the Japanese military empire. Intelligence officers began collecting testimonies and documentation, piecing together the outlines of a crime that had been hidden behind military secrecy for more than a decade. The psychological impact on the soldiers witnessing these discoveries was profound and lasting. Men who had endured some of the most intense combat in the Pacific Theater found themselves shaken by encounters with the comfort station survivors in ways that battlefield experiences had not prepared them for. One company commander wrote in his journal that finding the women had affected him more deeply than any firefight because the suffering he witnessed was not the chaotic violence of war but the calculated cruelty of an organized system. The realization that an empire had constructed machinery specifically designed to exploit and destroy these women challenged assumptions about the nature of the conflict. The women themselves experienced liberation as something closer to terror than joy. Years of conditioning could not be erased by the appearance of different uniforms and unfamiliar faces. The very concept of safety had been systematically destroyed within them. When American soldiers said they had come to help, the women heard words they could not trust because trust itself had become impossible. The process of convincing them that rescue was real, that they would not be harmed, required time and patience that the ongoing military campaign did not easily allow. Medical personnel found themselves facing challenges unlike any they had encountered in conventional combat medicine. The women's physical condition demanded immediate intervention, but the psychological damage made standard medical procedures impossible to implement. To approach with instruments, to ask someone to undress for examination, to shine lights for inspection, all triggered panic responses born from years of violation. Army nurses and doctors had to completely reimagine their protocols, finding ways to provide care that respected the trauma their patients had endured. Captain Helen Morrison, an Army nurse assigned to one of the evacuation hospitals receiving survivors, quickly recognized that conventional military medicine was inadequate for this situation. The women would not eat unless commanded to do so, as though waiting for permission. They refused to sleep in beds, instead curling on floors in corners, maintaining the vigilance that captivity had required. When asked to change into clean clothing, they froze, unable to comprehend that the offer might be genuine. Morrison wrote later that she had never encountered human beings so completely conditioned to expect only cruelty, and that learning to care for them required abandoning everything she had been taught about medical efficiency. The deployment of interpreters became essential, but complicated. Few American personnel spoke the necessary languages, and the women came from diverse linguistic backgrounds. The military located Japanese-American soldiers who could communicate in Korean or Chinese, but their presence initially created new problems. Women who had been victimized by Japanese soldiers saw Japanese faces in American uniforms and assumed they were being handed back to their tormentors. One interpreter, a woman named Keiko Tanaka, who had been born in Hawaii, recalled the moment she first spoke to a group of Korean survivors in their own language. The initial reaction was suspicion and fear. Only after she explained repeatedly that she was American, that she had never been to Japan, that she was there to help them, did some of the women begin to cautiously believe her. The process of establishing trust happened incrementally, through small gestures repeated consistently over days and weeks. A bowl of soup offered without demands. A blanket provided freely. The simple act of being left alone, unwatched, to wash in privacy. These small freedoms carried enormous weight for women who had been denied autonomy for years. Maria Santos, a Filipina survivor later interviewed about her experience, said that the moment she was given soap and water and told she could wash herself without anyone watching represented a more powerful proof of liberation than any verbal assurance. The restoration of privacy was the restoration of humanity. As American forces secured more territory across the Philippines, the pattern repeated at each garrison they captured. Soldiers cleared the military installations, secured perimeters against counterattack, and then discovered the hidden populations of women who had been trapped in the comfort stations. What began as combat operations transformed into humanitarian missions that required different skills and resources. Evacuation hospitals were reorganized to accommodate survivors who needed specialized care. Protocols were rewritten in real time, with medical personnel learning through experience how to treat trauma that went beyond physical injury. The shock of discovery rippled through the American military chain of command and eventually reached officials in Washington who struggled to comprehend the scale and nature of what had been uncovered. Initial reports seemed almost impossible to believe. An organized system of sexual slavery operating across an entire military empire? Women held captive for years in facilities designed specifically for their exploitation. The evidence, however, could not be dismissed. The survivors themselves were living proof, and the military documentation being recovered from abandoned Japanese positions confirmed the testimonies. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience of liberating the comfort stations changed them in ways that combat had not. Years later, veterans would speak about those encounters as defining moments that revealed dimensions of the war they had not understood before. One officer who participated in the liberation of a compound near Manila wrote that he had believed he was fighting to defeat an enemy army, but encountering the comfort women taught him that he was fighting against something much darker than military force. He was confronting a system that had industrialized cruelty and disguised it as policy. The women's reactions to liberation remained complex and painful even as the immediate danger passed. Freedom, when it finally came, did not feel triumphant. It felt fragile, uncertain, threaded with the fear that it might be temporary or illusory. Women who had been told for years that no one would rescue them, that the world had forgotten them, could not immediately embrace the reality that their captivity had ended. Some remained silent for days after liberation, unable or unwilling to speak. Others asked repeatedly if they would be punished, if their families would reject them, if they would be returned to the stations. The psychological architecture of control that had been built around them could not be dismantled as quickly as the physical walls that had confined them. Medical documentation from the period reveals the depth of the physical damage. Doctors treating the survivors found malnutrition so severe that some women weighed barely 80 pounds. Chronic untreated infections were universal. Sexually transmitted diseases had spread unchecked for years. Many survivors bore scars from beatings and other forms of violence. The medical charts filled with clinical notations that barely captured the human cost, describing symptoms and pathologies that represented years of systematic abuse condensed into measurements and diagnostic codes. Yet the physical damage, terrible as it was, proved easier to address than the psychological wounds. The women had been taught that soldiers always brought pain, that kindness was impossible, that submission was the only path to survival. These lessons had been reinforced daily through violence and control until they became foundational beliefs. Unlearning them required more than medical treatment. It required the patient reconstruction of trust, a process that could not be rushed and that many survivors would struggle with for the remainder of their lives. The discovery of the comfort stations and the liberation of the women trapped within them represented more than a humanitarian crisis requiring immediate response. It was evidence of a crime that had been carefully hidden, protected by military secrecy and the shame imposed on its victims. The American soldiers who uncovered the system became inadvertent witnesses to something they had not known existed, and their testimony, combined with the voices of survivors, would eventually force a reckoning with this hidden history. The immediate aftermath of liberation involved practical challenges that consumed resources and attention. Where would the women go? How could they be cared for in the midst of an ongoing military campaign? Who would take responsibility for their recovery and eventual repatriation? The army established temporary facilities to house survivors, but these were makeshift solutions to a problem of staggering complexity. Medical teams worked around the clock, but they were treating wounds that medicine alone could not heal. Some women expressed a desire to return to their homelands, to find what remained of the families they had been torn from. Others feared returning, worried that they would face rejection or shame. In traditional societies across Asia, victims of sexual violence often bore the stigma rather than the perpetrators. Women who had survived the comfort stations understood that going home might mean confronting not only the trauma of what had been done to them, but also the judgment of communities that might view them as dishonored. For many, the prospect of repatriation was almost as terrifying as their captivity had been. The American military worked with international relief organizations to develop programs for survivors who could not or would not return home. Vocational training was offered, along with continued medical care and assistance with resettlement. Yet these programs, well-intentioned as they were, could not fully address the scope of the problem. How do you rebuild a life that was stolen? How do you recover identity that was systematically destroyed? The women themselves would testify later that recovery was not measured in months or years but in decades, and that some wounds never truly healed. Cultural sensitivity became an important consideration in the aftermath. Relief workers attempted to provide traditional foods that might reconnect survivors with their heritage. Korean rice dishes, Chinese teas, Filipino fruits, small gestures meant to honor identity that the comfort station system had tried to erase. Clothing was offered that reflected traditional styles from the women's home cultures. Religious services were arranged in multiple languages, recognizing that for many survivors, spiritual practice represented a connection to self that had been denied during captivity. The psychological recovery of the survivors unfolded slowly and unevenly. Some women responded to care and began to rebuild their lives with remarkable resilience. Others remained locked in the trauma, unable to move beyond the years of abuse. The women who had been youngest when taken, some still children when their captivity began, faced particular challenges. Their entire adolescence and early adulthood had been consumed by the comfort station system. They had no memories of normal life to return to, no sense of who they might have been without the trauma that had defined them. For the American soldiers and medical personnel who participated in the liberation and initial care of the comfort station survivors, the experience left lasting impressions. Many carried memories of those encounters for the rest of their lives, describing them as moments that changed their understanding of war and humanity. Private Martinez wrote decades later that seeing the comfort women had taught him more about the cost of conflict than any battlefield casualty. The suffering he witnessed was not the chaotic violence of combat, but the organized cruelty of a system that had calculated its victims' pain. The broader military and political implications of the discovery took time to fully emerge. Initial reports focused on the humanitarian crisis and the immediate need for medical intervention. But as intelligence officers compiled testimonies and documentation, the outlines of a much larger story became clear. The comfort station system had not been a random occurrence or the work of rogue commanders. It had been a deliberate policy, organized at high levels of military planning, sustained over more than a decade, and hidden behind layers of euphemism and secrecy. The evidence recovered from abandoned Japanese installations included documents that confirmed the systematic nature of the program: requisition orders for the establishment of comfort stations, transportation manifests showing the movement of women from occupied territories to military garrisons, medical records tracking the health of comfort station workers with the cold, bureaucratic language of administration. These documents revealed that the system had been managed with the same organizational rigor applied to any other aspect of military logistics. The testimonies of survivors provided the human dimension that official documents could never capture. Women described being deceived with false promises of employment or simply taken by force from their homes. They recalled the journey to the comfort stations, often transported by ship or truck to remote locations they did not recognize. They spoke of the compounds where they were held, describing the barracks, the guard towers, the walls that made escape impossible. And they described the daily reality of life in the stations, the routine violence, the constant surveillance, the systematic destruction of hope. What emerged from these testimonies was a portrait of a system designed not merely to exploit but to dehumanize. The comfort station structure stripped women of their names, replacing them with numbers. It separated them from their language and culture, surrounding them with guards they could not communicate with. It denied them privacy, autonomy, and any sense of control over their own bodies. The system was not accidental cruelty, but calculated abuse, refined over years to maximize control while minimizing the possibility of resistance or escape. The liberation of the comfort women occurred against the backdrop of a wider war that was far from over. While medical teams worked to care for survivors and intelligence officers documented evidence of the comfort station system, combat continued across the Pacific. The Philippines campaign consumed months of brutal fighting. Islands were invaded, defended, and captured at enormous cost. The war's momentum was clearly shifting against Japan, but the Empire's forces continued to resist with desperation that made every advance a battle. In this context, the comfort station revelations competed for attention with more immediate military concerns. Commanders focused on operational objectives, on the next island to be taken, on the grinding advance toward Japan itself. The survivors became one more category of displaced persons in a war that had created millions of refugees and casualties. Their suffering, as profound as it was, risked being submerged in the larger tragedy of global conflict. Yet for those directly involved in the liberation and care of the comfort women, the experience could not be set aside. Nurses like Captain Morrison found that caring for the survivors changed their understanding of what it meant to heal. Medical treatment addressed symptoms, but true healing required recognition of the full scope of what had been done. It required acknowledging that these women were not simply casualties of war, but victims of a specific crime, one that deserved to be named and condemned. The soldiers who first entered the comfort stations and witnessed the conditions inside carried those memories with them through the remainder of the war and beyond. Some wrote letters home trying to describe what they had found, struggling to put into words experiences that defied easy explanation. Others kept journals, recording details they feared might otherwise be lost or dismissed as exaggeration. These personal accounts would later provide historians with invaluable primary source material about the liberation and its immediate aftermath. As 1944 turned to 1945 and the war entered its final phase, more comfort stations were discovered across the territories being liberated from Japanese control. Each revelation added to the growing body of evidence about the system's scale and organization. The stations were found in Burma, in the Dutch East Indies, in Malaya, in the Pacific Islands, everywhere the Japanese military had established a presence. The pattern was unmistakable. This had been an empire-wide program implemented across vast geographic distances with consistent methodology. The end of the war in August 1945 brought both relief and new complications for comfort station survivors. Japan's surrender meant that the immediate danger was past, but it also meant that attention shifted rapidly to demobilization, occupation, and reconstruction. The survivors risked becoming forgotten in the rush to move forward, their suffering relegated to the category of unfortunate but unremarkable wartime tragedy. Some women simply disappeared into the chaos of the post-war period, choosing anonymity over the difficult process of seeking recognition or justice. Others began the long journey home, returning to Korea, to China, to the Philippines with hopes of reuniting with families and rebuilding lives. These returns were often bittersweet. Some women found their families had survived and welcomed them back. Others discovered that parents had died, homes had been destroyed, communities had been scattered, and many faced the additional burden of stigma, as cultural attitudes about sexual violence meant that survivors were sometimes viewed as shameful rather than as victims deserving of sympathy and support. The Allied occupation of Japan created opportunities to document and investigate war crimes, including the comfort station system. Military tribunals were convened to try Japanese officials and military officers for various offences. Evidence about the comfort stations was presented, and some perpetrators faced prosecution. Yet the full scope of the system and the experiences of its victims did not receive the attention many survivors and their advocates believed it deserved. Other war crimes dominated the proceedings, and the comfort station issue risked being minimized or overlooked. In the years immediately following the war, most comfort station survivors chose silence. The social stigma associated with their experiences made public testimony dangerous to their reputations and their ability to reintegrate into their communities. Many married and raised families without ever speaking about what they had endured. Some moved to new locations where their past was unknown, preferring to build lives free from the weight of memory. The silence was not acceptance, but survival, a recognition that the world was not ready to hear their stories. Decades passed. The women who had been young when taken into the comfort station system aged into middle age and then old age, carrying their memories privately. Some experienced psychological difficulties throughout their lives, struggling with trauma that had never been properly addressed. Others found ways to live with what had happened, compartmentalizing the past while focusing on the present. But the memories never truly faded, and for many survivors, the lack of acknowledgement felt like a second injustice layered on top of the first. The breakthrough came gradually, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating in the 1990s, when some survivors decided that silence was no longer acceptable. Elderly women in Seoul, in Manila, in Taipei began to speak publicly about their experiences as comfort women. They shared their stories with journalists, with historians, with anyone willing to listen. Their testimony was powerful precisely because it had been so long suppressed and because these women, now grandmothers, were finally claiming space to tell truths that had been denied for 40 years. The impact of these late testimonies was profound. Younger generations who had grown up in the post-war period suddenly learned about a chapter of history that had been hidden or minimized. Activists took up the cause, demanding official acknowledgement from the Japanese government and seeking justice for survivors. International human rights organizations recognized the comfort station system as a clear example of systematic sexual slavery and war crimes. The issue moved from private memory to public discourse, from individual tragedy to collective responsibility. The survivors who chose to speak publicly faced significant personal costs. They endured skepticism from those who questioned their accounts or their motives. They faced criticism from people who believed they should have maintained silence rather than bringing shame to their nations or families. And they relived their trauma repeatedly as they testified before courts, commissions, and media outlets. Yet they persisted, driven by a belief that acknowledgement and justice were worth the pain of remembering. The legacy of the comfort station system and its liberation extends far beyond the immediate historical moment. The survivors' testimony contributed to evolving international standards about war crimes and crimes against humanity. The documentation of systematic sexual slavery in wartime influenced the development of legal frameworks intended to hold perpetrators accountable and to recognize sexual violence as a weapon of war rather than an unfortunate byproduct. The comfort women became a case study in how exploitation operates in conflict zones and how survivors can be marginalized even after liberation. Educational initiatives emerged to ensure that future generations would know about the comfort station system and understand its implications. Museums and memorials were established in several countries to honor the survivors and to preserve the historical record. Documentary films and scholarly books explored different dimensions of the story, from the military planning that created the system to the personal experiences of individual women. The goal was to prevent erasure, to ensure that this history would not be forgotten or dismissed. The survivors themselves became advocates not only for recognition of their own suffering, but for all victims of sexual violence in conflict. They spoke at international forums about the importance of protecting vulnerable populations during war. They worked with human rights organizations to develop protocols for responding to sexual slavery when it was discovered. They mentored younger activists who carried their message to new audiences. In their old age, these women who had once been silenced became powerful voices for justice. The political dimensions of the comfort station issue remained contentious decades after the war ended. Debates about official apologies, about compensation for survivors, about how history should be taught in schools, all became flashpoints in international relations. Some argued that the focus on historical grievances prevented reconciliation and forward movement. Others insisted that true reconciliation required full acknowledgement of past crimes and meaningful accountability. The survivors found themselves at the center of these debates, their experiences politicized even as they sought simple recognition of what had been done to them. Despite the controversies and challenges, the core truth remained undeniable. The comfort station system had existed. It had exploited tens of thousands of women. It had operated with official sanction and organizational planning, and it had been hidden behind walls of secrecy that were only breached when military defeat made concealment impossible. The liberation of comfort stations by American forces in 1944 and 1945 had been the first step in a much longer process of revelation, a process that continued long after the physical walls came down. The women who survived the comfort stations carried lessons that extended beyond their individual experiences. Their survival itself was a form of resistance against a system designed to break them. Their willingness to eventually speak, despite all the pressures toward silence, was an act of courage that challenged powerful forces invested in forgetting. And their insistence on dignity and recognition became a model for other survivors of systematic abuse, seeking to have their voices heard and their suffering acknowledged. The story of the comfort women and their liberation is ultimately a story about power and its abuse, about the capacity of organized systems to inflict tremendous harm, and about the resilience of human beings even in the face of deliberate cruelty. It is also a story about memory and erasure, about how histories can be hidden and how they can eventually be recovered through the determination of survivors and their allies. The American soldiers who first encountered the comfort stations in the Philippines could not have known that their discovery would reverberate across decades, that the women they found would eventually become symbols of resistance and advocates for justice. They knew only that they had found people in desperate need, and that responding to that need was an obligation that transcended military objectives. In the final accounting, the liberation of the comfort stations accomplished something essential, even if incomplete. It shattered the walls that had kept the women hidden. It created a record that could not be entirely suppressed. It planted seeds that would eventually grow into a broader movement for recognition and justice. The women walked out of those compounds into a world that did not initially understand what they had endured, but they survived to eventually tell their stories in their own voices. That survival, hard-won and costly, ensured that the comfort station system could not remain buried in the shadows where its architects had tried to hide it. The truth emerged slowly, painfully, but it emerged. and in that emergence lay both the condemnation of past crimes and the hope that recognition might prevent their repetition.